I wake before the light most mornings, not because I have somewhere to be or because an alarm tells me to get up, but because the house and I keep each other on the same quiet schedule now, the pipes groaning once, the refrigerator shuddering like a sleepy animal, the furnace taking a breath even when it is not cold enough to justify it. And I lie there counting the familiar sounds as if they were prayer beads, half hoping to hear a voice from the kitchen that will never speak again, and half ashamed for hoping, because Nora has been gone 7 years and a man of 76 ought to have learned by now which doors of memory to leave shut. Nevertheless, I rise, ease my feet into the slippers my daughter bought me when she still believed. Gifts were a substitute for visiting, and I pad down the hallway past the frames that hold our life in pictures, the wedding in '69, a toddler with cake smeared across her cheeks, a boy with a paper crown from a fast food birthday, a fishing trip, where I pretended to like the boat because the kids were smiling. In the kitchen, I stand at the counter and take my time with the coffee the way Nora taught me when we were young. And she said that the trick was to treat ordinary things as if they were precious. So I measure the grounds with the same dented spoon and wait for the kettle to sing and pour in a circle and inhale. And for a few minutes the day tastes like it once did before the business of doctors and probate and awkward holidays. In the new language of boundaries and self-care that my children use, the way I used to use duct tape to fix everything that wasn't really broken. And while the coffee drips, I butter a heel of bread and sit at the small table under the window and watch the street where the maples lean toward each other like old men scheming. The newspaper still comes, although I canceled it twice in rashes of economy, and the carrier, a boy who refuses to look up when I say good morning, keeps tossing it on my steps like a dare, and I keep giving in fishing quarters from the jar by the door and tucking them into an envelope with a note that says, "Thank you." Because I was a shop teacher for 39 years, and some habits, sweeping the sawdust, lining up the tools, paying what you owe, are not so much habits as bones that hold you upright. I live on the edge of town in a brown single-story that I painted myself after Nora died, the sort of job an old man takes on to keep his hands busy and his neighbors reassured. And I chose a color that looked like coffee with too much cream, because Nora would have teased me for being timid and then secretly approved, and if I stand on the front step and look left, I can see the elementary school where my grandchildren used to play at the age when everyone still claps for a cartwheel, and if I look right, I can see the low brick building of the funeral home where we said goodbye to my father and then to Nora, which is one of those absurd alignments a town gives you once you've sat in it long enough, childhood and endings parked within the same gaze, and maybe that's why the mornings feel heavier lately, because the same eyes have to take in what was and what will be and make a peace between them. I keep a tidy house, and by tidy I don't mean showroom clean or magazine neat. I mean the kind of order that lets a man find his pliers in the dark. That means bills are filed in an old metal tin under the sink with a rubber band that smells faintly of onions from the basket above. That means the jar of screws is labeled slotted and the jar of bolts is labeled hex. And the junk drawer is not actually junk, but a museum of contingencies. Spare keys, the stub of a pencil, a church bulletin with Nora's handwriting circling the word potluck like a smile. The doctor tells me to walk, and so I do, not far and not fast, to the end of Osborne Street and back, nodding to the houses that have learned my pace, and sometimes I carry a plastic bag and pick up the cans that roll out of trucks because I can't stand the sight of them against the ditch grass. And sometimes I stop at Lyle and Marianne's fence and lean there for a few minutes while Marianne tells me about her sister's hip replacement, and I pretend I haven't heard this exact chronology twice already, and it is a comfort to offer the proper little astonishments in the proper places, to say, "Lord, that's something," when it is what is asked of me. Afterward I come home, wipe my feet on the mat Nora crocheted from old T-shirts, and sit at the table again with a pencil and the ledger where I track expenses. A habit my son calls obsessive when he thinks he is being kind and controlling when he thinks I can't hear him. But it is the only way I know to keep the edges of the month from unraveling. So I write down the dates and amounts and still exile the certain words from the page: emergency, delinquent, because I refuse to give them any more room in the house than they already take up, in the fear of night. The children exist in my days the way distant radio stations exist on the dial, always there if you turn enough, but fuzzy, unreliable, slightly hostile to the room you're actually sitting in. And when they call, which is to say when my phone lights, up with my daughter's name once every few weeks or my son's number every other month with a text that reads, "You good?" Like a memo from a foreman, I fetch the phone as if I've been summoned to a principal's office and make my voice smooth with gratitude, because appearing ungrateful has become, in their accounting, the greater sin than being unvisited. They are not bad people, I tell myself, and anyone who will listen. They are busy. They live 2 towns over with traffic that seems to grow. Even when the houses don't, they have jobs that require words like deliverables and onboarding. They have children with orthodontists and soccer schedules and a school fundraiser that sells wrapping paper you'd think was woven out of gold leaf. And I find a way to sound proud that they live in this century so fearlessly, even as I nurse the small sting of being an artifact that must sometimes be dusted and sometimes hidden when company comes. Sundays I still sit in the back pew, not because I am especially devout. Nora was the believer in our pair, and she carried enough faith for both of us like a picnic basket. And not because the pastor says new things, which he does not, but because the sanctuary gives me a place to rest my eyes on the particular shade of light that stained glass makes when it touches old wood, and because the women in the choir insist on hugging me like I am a fragile instrument that needs tuning, and because when the benediction is over, we shuffle to the fellowship hall and drink weak coffee out of white cups, and I feel, for a quarter hour, like a man who has been included in the plans of the living. Afterward I go home and open the window over the sink if the air will let me, and the breeze carries the smell of cut grass and the faint metallic note of the train that slides past the edge of town at 2 p.m, as if obeying a law older than our streets. If you ask what I do with my time, I could pretend that I read more than I do, that I am making my way through the great books that I stacked on the bookshelf after retirement, with an earnestness that embarrasses me now. But the truth is, I read the same 3 novels over and over because they keep my wife alive in the margins, where she underlined a sentence and wrote yes or ha, and once drew a tiny star next to a description of a kitchen that looked nothing like ours. I also watch baseball, with the sound low so the house can still think, and I make soup in batches that would feed a platoon because I have not unlearned the math of family, and I wrap the extra in labeled containers and line them like little soldiers in the freezer, and then once a month I take a few to the shelter and sign my name in a cramped book like it means more than it does, and a woman with very tired eyes says, "Thank you," as if the words cost her money. There are days when I am proud of the life I have salvaged from the ruin that grief makes of a man, days when I repair the hinge of a cupboard and feel the same private triumph I used to feel when a sullen boy learned to plane a board flat. And there are days when I sit on the edge of my bed with my socks in my hands and cannot remember whether I was putting them on or taking them off, and I tell myself it is only because the room was too quiet and gathered me into its silence like a tide, on. Those days I take the truck, the old Ford that rattles but refuses surrender, and I drive the long way to the grocery store that still stocks the exact brand of dill pickles Nora loved, and I lower my shoulder to the refrigerator case and peer at the jars like they might answer a question, and the cashier, who knows my name because I do not change my routines, says, "How are you doing, Mr. Mercer?" And I say, "Can't complain," because that is the password that keeps men like me from crying in public. I am not poor, exactly, but money is a careful conversation I have with myself most evenings, a tone I measure and adjust, and though the pension arrives and the house is paid for and the numbers in the ledger generally behave, I have learned that generosity can be a kind of illness when you want to be loved by people who prefer to be pleased. So the checks I used to write for this or that emergency of my children have become smaller and less automatic, and I keep the checkbook in the drawer with the letter opener and the tape, and I keep my will in a folder in the hall closet under the quilts. And I tell myself that order is the same as safety, even if I know it is not. Still, When the phone rings late, I answer on the first breath. Because fathers do not retire from the alarm in their bones, and because a man can be both resolved and ready, both disappointed and loyal, both certain of the shape of his solitude and soft in the places where the past presses. In the evenings I sit on the back steps with a glass of water and let the day fade the way an old photograph fades, slowly but without argument. And I think about the way time has been folding itself lately, how yesterday and 30 years ago can sit down next to each other and share a plate, and I think about Nora's hands, the way she could hold my wrist and feel my mood as plainly as a pulse. And I think about my children, how every kindness from them now arrives with a slickness to it, a layer of managerial enthusiasm that slides off the skin. And I wonder if that is simply the language of their world or the price of mine. And because I am honest, I admit that I have made my mistakes, that when I was younger I mistook providing for presents and thought fixing a thing was the same as understanding it, that I left feelings on the porch like muddy boots and expected them to wait. But a man can't go back with a different set of tools. He can only sand the edges of what remains and try not to splinter. And so I finish my water, turn off the kitchen light, check the back door twice, and go to bed in a house that has become both a museum and a harbor, telling myself, as sleep decides, that tomorrow I will call the kids and ask about the grandchildren's school play, and that I will say with real cheer that the lilacs are almost ready, that the paint on the porch rail is holding, and that their old man can still carry 2 bags of mulch without stopping to breathe. It began, as disruptions often do, not with a thunderclap, but with something almost ridiculous, the kind of detail you could easily dismiss if you were not already trained by years of solitude to notice the tremors in the ordinary, and for me it was the shape of an envelope sitting crooked in the metal mouth of my mailbox, heavier than the usual circulars and political flyers, thick in a way that suggested it carried either importance or insult, though I could not yet decide which. And when I carried it back inside and sat at the kitchen table with my glasses sliding down my nose, I saw that it was addressed not in a familiar hand, but in the tidy script of the local newspaper office, the Gazette, which had not written to me in the 3 decades I had been paying them for their second-hand truths. At first I thought it was another subscription warning, or perhaps a solicitation for some commemorative booklet, but when I slid it open with the edge of my butter knife and unfolded the insert, my heart went cold, because staring up at me was a printed announcement bordered in black, the sort of formal notice usually reserved for strangers and the newly dead, and there in bold letters was my own name, my exact name, with the words, "Funeral services for Mr. Howard Mercer, beloved father and grandfather, will be held Saturday at Greenwood Cemetery, followed by a reception at the residence of his daughter, Mrs. Susan Keller." For a moment my mind refused to accept what my eyes told me, and I sat with the paper flat before me, waiting for some other meaning to crawl out of the text. But no. It was plain and public, a death notice declaring me gone, a ceremony scheduled, my existence closed with final punctuation. I could not breathe properly as I looked at it, and I remember pressing my hand against the table as though to confirm its solidity, because I suddenly felt like a ghost in my own kitchen, still capable of touch, but erased in print. My first thought, absurdly, was that there must have been another Howard Mercer in town, but Greenwood is not New York, and Mercers are not so common here that the coincidence could be believed. Then I wondered if it was some clerical error, but the address of my daughter's house as the site of the reception cut away any hope of accident. It was deliberate, and the signature at the bottom, "Arrangements by Kelton and Sons Funeral Home," stabbed at my memory because that was the very place where we had laid Nora, and I remembered the walnut casket and the director's solemn, rehearsed voice, and the way my children had whispered among themselves while I signed papers, and now those same children had evidently signed other papers that made me vanish. I sat there for a long time, the notice trembling in my hand, and my coffee went cold beside me. Then, with a surge of disbelief, I picked up the phone and called my daughter, and of course it went to voicemail, her recorded voice brisk and professional, telling me she could not come to the phone but to leave a message, and I did. my words stumbling. "Susan, don't you? It's your father. I just received something. I don't understand. Please call me back right away." And then I hung up and immediately tried my son, whose line rang 4 times before collapsing into silence. And I did not bother leaving a message because I could picture his expression already, the half-smile that meant he considered my concerns unnecessary, and I could not bear to imagine him listening to my panic and shrugging. I sat by the phone for the better part of an hour, staring at the notice, reading it again and again as though the text might shift into a different meaning if I stared long enough. But it did not, and eventually I felt a new sensation, a chill that was not fear exactly, but a recognition that my world had tilted into a different kind of play, one in which the lines were being written for me by others, and they had cast me in the role of the deceased. When evening came and still no call returned, I walked down to the end of Osborne Street and unfolded the Gazette at the light of the lamp-post, and there on page 4, in the community announcements, was the same notice, printed for the whole town, too. See, my name and my children's names arranged around my absence as though the story of my death belonged to them. A couple of neighbors passed and gave me a cautious nod, and I felt a flare of paranoia, wondering whether they had already read it, whether they believed it, whether they looked at me now as an apparition haunting the street. Back at home I paced the rooms like an intruder, every picture frame on the wall suddenly sinister. Because what is a man? If the world agrees he is gone, he becomes at best an error, and at worst a nuisance to be corrected. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the armchair with the notice on my lap and the clock ticking too loudly, and I thought about all the times my children had spoken in half-jokes about inheritance, about how the house would come in handy some day, about how I ought to consider moving into assisted living before I lost track of things. I remembered a conversation after Nora's funeral, when I caught a glance between them, quick as a spark, and wondered then if I had been imagining it. But now, staring at this printed proof, I knew I had not. Somewhere between grief and routine, they had begun rehearsing for a life without me, and now, impatient, they had skipped to the performance. The next morning, exhausted but alert, I made my decision. I could not wait for them to call, because silence was its own answer. I would have to see for myself what this mockery meant. The notice said Saturday, Greenwood Cemetery, 2 in the afternoon. I folded it into my jacket pocket like evidence and rehearsed what I might say if confronted, though the truth is I had no plan beyond showing up, no strategy beyond refusing to stay dead. For 3 days I lived like a man counting down to his own execution, my meals tasteless, my walks shortened, the neighbors avoided, because every glance from them felt like complicity. I polished my shoes, not out of vanity, but out of some instinct that if I was to confront my own funeral, I should arrive not as a beggar, but as myself, upright, undeniable. And on the morning of the appointed day, when the sky was the pale gray of unwashed stone, I climbed into my truck and drove toward Greenwood, carrying nothing but the notice and a heart that beat as though it meant to prove its own existence louder than any sermon that might be preached above my empty grave. I parked 2 rows back from the green canopy so I could watch without becoming the spectacle I already was, and for a long minute I simply sat with my hands on the wheel, letting the scene assemble itself the way a stage play assembles from props and patience, the rectangle of astroturf laid over the earth like a polite lie, the folding chairs set in 2 sorrowful ranks, the bouquet that leaned against a polished casket, whose sheen was too bright for grief, and whose size I recognized with a lurch because it matched the very model Nora had chosen from a brochure when she was too tired to argue with me, and the sight of that walnut box with its fake satin made me dizzy, not only for the theft of the image, but because I knew caskets are heavy, even when empty, and the 2 men from Kelton and Sons were carrying this one as if it were a picnic cooler, which told me, in a detail more brutal than any headline, that the ritual was a performance built upon absence, a hollow claiming to be full, my life reduced to the convenience of portability. I eased the door shut and walked along the outer road of the cemetery, keeping to the hedge, rehearsing for the 100th time the promise I had made to myself on the drive, that I would not rush forward with foolish shouting, that I would not give, them the dignity of calling me hysterical, that I would witness with the steadiness of a man who has worked with his hands and knows the difference between solid wood and veneered particle board. And as I edged closer, I began to recognize the guests. Faces from the neighborhood and church, the grocer, who always slips me a discount on day-old rye, the clerk from the hardware store, a scattering of Nora's bridge partners, and a cousin from the state line who hasn't sent a Christmas card since his divorce, all of them arranged by the occasion into a tableau that felt familiar and wrong. The women clutching tissues, the men holding their hats, and every one of them looking toward the aisle as my daughter emerged in a black dress that fit her. Like an argument and my son in a suit he saves for promotions, both of them composed in a way that would have made me proud on any other day, chin high, shoulders square, expressions tuned to the exact frequency of respectable loss. There was a framed photograph on an easel, the same studio portrait Nora loved, the one where I am slightly out of focus because the photographer was more interested in making the children luminous, and someone had tied a black ribbon at the corner, which would have been touching if the sentiment were real, but now felt like a theft of a memory I had earned, with decades of lunches and light bulbs and long drives to recitals that were more waiting than music. I stood with my back to a maple and listened as the pastor from St. Luke's began his remarks, and he spoke kindly because he only knew the part of me that sang off-key and hauled tables for the pancake breakfast. Yet even his kindness sounded scripted today, as if my children had provided a set of bullet points they preferred, virtues smoothed into platitudes, industrious and principled and sometimes stubborn, the last word landing with a faint emphasis that made a few people glance at each other, the sort of sanctioned criticism families allow when a body is safely unavailable to contradict them. When the pastor invited remembrances, a neighbor stood and told a story about my fixing his fence after a storm, and then an old colleague from the shop class spoke about my teaching boys how to square a corner and girls how to use a drill without apology, and I felt a lump that might have been gratitude if it weren't wrapped in the absurdity of hearing my obituary while my feet were in the grass. And then my daughter stepped forward with the pages in her hand and a tremor in her voice so delicate you could almost miss the calculation, and she said that her father was a man of routines who had difficulty with change, that he loved hard in the way men of his generation did, which sounded like praise until she added that sometimes love like that misses the person standing in front of it, and there was a ripple of knowing murmurs that made me burn from the collar outward. She went on to talk about seasons and turning leaves and the mercy of endings, and then my son, whose natural tongue is strategy, took the microphone to thank those who had supported the family as we navigated Dad's decline, a phrase that almost unmoored me from the tree because it planted in the public air the lie they had been cultivating in private, and he spoke of ensuring safety and honoring wishes and next steps, and each bland syllable carried a ledger of intentions. And as he closed with a note about how his father would have wanted everyone to gather afterward at Susan's to celebrate a full life, I saw, beyond the chairs, my eldest grandson leaning against the sedan with his phone up, recording the scene with the breezy detachment of an intern covering a ribbon cutting, and I had to look away to steady my stomach. The director from Kelton and Sons stood near the casket, a tall man in a suit that tried too hard, his face attentive as a waiter, and when the time came to simulate the lowering, the device clicked and hummed dutifully, and the straps moved as if burdened, and yet one of the employees, the younger one with acne scars around his jaw, allowed his eyes to drift toward the hedge where I stood, and I felt a shock of recognition because he had been the same boy who wheeled Nora for her last viewing, and I could read on his face a confusion he could not afford to articulate, that he had been told a story, and the story did not match the evidence of a living man 2 maple trunks away. He recovered himself, and afterward, when the chairs began to scrape and the murmur of reunion rose like a flock of birds, I edged along the side to the portable table where the guest book lay open, with a pen attached by a chain, and for an instant, just to feel an edge of mischief in a day of thefts, I considered signing my own name with a neat flourish, and the note arrived late. But I settled instead for scanning the page, counting the signatures, noting the cluster of names from my children's offices, managers and HR specialists who had come to supervise grief the way they supervise workflows, and spotting the tidy square letters of a local realtor whose card had appeared under my doormat twice this spring with the cheerful suggestion that now might be a great time to downsize. I drifted with the group as they made their way to the parking area, staying far enough behind to be another mourner, unimportant and unremarked, and as engines turned over and doors slammed, there was at least one sharp noise of laughter from a knot of younger cousins, quickly shushed, and I thought of how quickly solemnity thins when it is not anchored by truth, how easily a mock funeral becomes a rehearsal dinner for a life without burden. I watched my daughter at the trunk of her car, directing traffic with polite efficiency, telling people to follow her, assuring them there would be plenty of food, and when a woman laid a hand on her arm in sympathy, I saw Susan's face soften into the look she used when she negotiated a discount. Vulnerability as instrument, and I felt a grief that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with the child I had known. There was a moment when an old church friend, Mrs. Hanley with the powdery cheeks, turned in my direction and squinted, and my pulse leapt. But she only adjusted her glasses and kept walking, and I understood that invisibility had chosen me for camouflage the way fog chooses a field. As the procession of cars pulled out toward my daughter's neighborhood, I let them go ahead and fell in at the end, my truck chugging like an old dog. And on the drive I argued with myself about whether to end this farce at the threshold or let it run another act so I could learn the contours of the scheme, and prudence won, because I had begun to realize that the power of their plan lay not in their malice, but in my surprise. And surprise is a tool one can use only once. If I spent it out on the lawn, I would gain the cheap thrill of shock and lose the chance to hear what they say when they believe the room is safe. We turned into the subdivision where Susan lives, a loop of newish houses that all wear the same smile, porches with purposeful rocking chairs and flags at attention, and hedges trimmed into disciplined humps, and cars lined the curb like a mini parade. And when I parked at the far corner and came up the sidewalk between two oaks, I could already hear the clink of glass and the particular lift in a human voice that attends relief, disguised as remembrance. Inside, through the wide front window framed by tasteful drapes, I saw the kind of gathering people call a celebration of life, because the phrase permits laughter without guilt, the kitchen island crowded with catered trays. An aunt I barely recognized guarding the deviled eggs like a dragon, a trio of colleagues from Susan's office arranging a photo board where my face appeared in decades, the fishing hat I rarely wore, the barbecue apron I did use, the snapshots that reduce a life to festive categories, and beyond them, in the living room, my son had taken up a position near the mantel like a host at an awards show, receiving condolences and dispatching instructions, plates in the dining room, drinks on the deck, children. Downstairs, while my daughter moved through the rooms with a clipboard I had never seen in her hand, but that seemed as natural to her now as her wedding ring, I stood under the maple by the porch and listened through the cracked window over the sink, catching phrases as they drifted on the conditioned air. He went peacefully, we've been preparing, it's what he would have wanted, and then threaded. Between the consolations, other words in the idiom of planning, the paperwork, the appraisal, Monday with the notary, utilities transferred, and each one struck like a small stone, not because I had not expected them, but because of the fluency with which they were spoken, as if this language had been practiced in private for months. There are people who will say that I should have walked straight in at that moment, flung the door wide, and named the sin for what it was. And I confess there was a savage joy in picturing the crystal glasses slipping from fingers, the neighbor with his cheese cube frozen halfway to his mouth, my son's jaw performing a new geometry, my daughter's clipboard falling like a verdict. But there are also anglers who will tell you that the fish which thrashes loudest in shallow water is easiest to net, and I had no intention of thrashing. I would let them swim in the bright shallows of their confidence a little longer, would let them boast about the cleverness of a funeral without a body and a father without a vote, would let them tell someone, trusted and loose-lipped the secret corners of the plan. Then I would decide how best to be alive in a room that had already divided the spoils of my absence. So I took a breath, felt the bark at my back, watched the way the sunlight made a halo in the frizz of my granddaughter's hair as she carried a plate to the patio, and made a quiet oath that I would go the distance with this charade, not to outwit them in cruelty, but to force the truth into daylight before the whole assembly. And as I eased away along the hedgerow toward the side gate, intending to find a vantage at the back deck where men like my son speak most freely when a beer softens their tongues, I felt something that frightened me more than anger, a steadiness like the click of a safety going off, not the safety on a weapon, but the safety a man carries around his heart to keep from saying what he knows it had clicked off of its own accord, and the next word from their mouths would decide how I used that new and unmerciful calm. From my position at the edge of the deck, I could see the party swelling into something that bore no resemblance to mourning. The music turned low but steady, the kind of background jazz one hears in real estate offices, the hum of conversation, climbing in registers until it sounded like celebration without apology. And I watched as plates of food were filled and emptied, glasses refilled, laughter surfacing like bubbles that no one bothered to stifle. And I felt the peculiar vertigo of standing inside a lie so bold that it stopped pretending to be polite. For there is something uniquely humiliating about hearing your children toast your absence with the ease of people congratulating themselves on a successful project. And the worst of it was how quickly the guests adapted, how the neighbors and cousins and co-workers slipped into the script offered them. A script that said the old man had passed. It was natural. And now we could all breathe easier, and with each minute I realized more clearly that I was not only the victim of a family scheme, but the unwilling witness of a communal rehearsal for a future where I was erased without resistance. My son stood near the deck railing with a tumbler in hand, speaking in that confident cadence he had perfected in conference rooms, and I leaned closer through the open screen to catch his words, which were not the words of grief, but of logistics. Phrases like, "The property taxes roll over automatically if we file by June," and "the accounts should be accessible within 2 weeks once the bank receives the declaration." And I understood with a chill that this gathering was not only a parody of a wake, but also a board meeting disguised in black clothing, a negotiation with finger foods. And then my daughter approached, clipboard still in her hand as though the stage props of mourning were not enough, and she spoke with a thin smile about an appraiser scheduled to come by next Tuesday, how she had already begun drafting an email to the realtor, how she hoped to list before the market cooled in autumn, and her words, practical and bloodless, were punctuated by the clink of ice in her glass, and I felt the rage coil inside me like a spring, because every syllable confirmed what the notice in the paper had suggested. My life had been converted into a transaction, my existence translated into square footage and balances, my flesh rewritten into equity. But rage is a strange companion, and instead of driving me forward, it pinned me still, so that I became not an intruder, but a listening device, registering every careless confidence, every remark that revealed how far the betrayal had progressed. And I heard a cousin ask quietly whether they were certain this arrangement was safe, whether anyone might challenge it, and my son answered with the assurance of a man who believes the universe bends toward him, explaining that they had prepared affidavits, that a sympathetic doctor had already noted signs of cognitive decline, that it would be enough to justify their actions should any questions arise. And my daughter added, with a sharp laugh, that their father was too stubborn to go to lawyers, that he would never imagine his children capable of such efficiency. And the guests chuckled, not cruelly but compliantly, as if relieved to be included in the secret. And at that moment I understood the cruelty more deeply than ever, because it was not only a plot between siblings, but a performance that required an audience, a small society nodding along, confirming with their silence that I was obsolete. I watched my grandchildren chase each other across the yard, their shrieks piercing the dusk like bright knives, and I wanted to believe they were innocent of this charade, that they still thought of me as the man who showed them how to hold a hammer, who carried peppermints in his pocket for long car rides. But then I saw my eldest, the boy with the phone, showing the funeral program to a friend and laughing, and the sound of his amusement broke something I had not realized was still intact. Because grandchildren are supposed to be the bridge that softens the distance between generations, and to see him use my counterfeit death as entertainment felt like being erased twice over, first by my children, and then by the children of my children, as though the cruelty had been inherited like an heirloom. The sun had dropped low enough that the deck lights flickered on, casting the scene in a soft yellow glow, and from where I stood I could see my photograph again, propped on the mantel inside the living room, illuminated not by reverence, but by convenience, and the absurdity struck me so hard that I nearly laughed aloud, for it was my face, my living face, staring down on this gathering of smug survivors, and I felt an almost physical need to shatter the frame, to rip down the evidence of my own dispossession, but I stayed where I was, gripping the porch rail until the wood cut into my palm, because I knew the moment was not yet, that bursting in with anger now would give them a story to tell about their senile father crashing his own service, a story they would twist into proof of instability, and so I held myself back with the iron restraint of a man who has sanded wood until his fingers bled, and I reminded myself that patience is a weapon too, that the longer I watched, the more truth they revealed. The midpoint of a man's life is supposed to be memory, a backward glance, but I stood there at the midpoint of this evening, realizing it was instead a reckoning, a fork between silence and defiance, and for the first time since Nora's passing I felt something that was not grief and not loneliness, but a raw purpose. The knowledge that what had been done to me was not a misunderstanding to be corrected, but a crime to be exposed, and the exposure would mean more if it came not in a private quarrel, but in front of this assembly, these neighbors and cousins who had already nodded their consent, because to drag my children's betrayal into the light was to reclaim not only my life, but my dignity, and perhaps to teach even the most compliant. Witness that an old man is not so easily buried. So I waited, listening, gathering every scrap of evidence, watching their smiles stretch thin with drink, watching the careless gestures of ownership as my son gestured toward my house, with a confidence that turned my stomach, and I knew with an aching certainty that this night was a crossing, the moment when the ground of my quiet routines cracked open and forced me to step across into a territory where there would be no return to simple mornings and modest ledgers. For once, a man has seen his own children toast his death and divide his possessions before he has even drawn his last breath. He cannot go back to being only a father or a neighbor or a retired teacher. He must become something sharper, harder, a witness who refuses to be silent, a survivor who insists on being seen. And as the laughter inside swelled 1 degree louder, I felt the scales tip. The midpoint passed, and the story of my life pivot toward a battle I had not sought but could no longer avoid. I slipped along the side of the house to the gate that sticks on humid days, and found, with the kind of luck that feels like permission, that someone had propped it open with a shoe, and the shoe, when I glanced down, was my own old deck shoe with the heel mashed, the one I lost last summer when the garbage men came early and I ran out to drag the can. And the sight of it there used as a wedge in my daughter's garden felt like a small insult placed as a welcome, so I let myself through and kept to the hedge until I reached the mudroom door that opens into the kitchen, and I listened for a full half-minute to make sure the laughter on the deck covered the sound of the latch before I tried it. And finding it unlocked, I slid inside into the smell of lemon cleaner and new paint and the faint perfume of lilies brought by someone who thinks grief prefers expensive flowers. And for a breath I only stood with my back to the closed door and stared at the neat order of the space that had become a command center, coolers along the floor, a stack of foil pans labeled in a tight hand with reheating instructions, a white board on the wall with a list that made my skin prickle, obit placed Tuesday, program printed Thursday, service Saturday 2 p.m., reception 3 p.m. Monday, bank and utilities, Tuesday, appraisal, Wednesday notary and TOD forms, Thursday, clean out. And the calm certainty of those words, their domestic authority, made me understand that what was happening to me had not been improvised in a fit of childish resentment but mapped like a project with dependencies and deadlines and expected outcomes, and I felt the strange steadiness again, the one that had switched on in the yard, the sensation that the heart had traded its softness for a tool. I moved down the hall toward the study that Susan calls her home office when she is trying to sound important, and found the door pulled almost shut, the kind of almost that suggests a wish to conceal without encouraging suspicion. And when I eased it, open with 2 fingers, the first thing I saw was the photo board laid on the rug, a duplicate of the one in the living room, but with extra images the curate must have rejected for being too ordinary. And there, tucked into the corner of a frame, was Nora's grocery list in her round hand, saved like a relic and repurposed as set dressing for a life they were bidding farewell to, while casually discarding the substance, and beyond that the desk itself had been turned into a staging table, folders, arranged in a fan-like hand after hand of cards, green for banking, red for property, manila for medical, and on top of the medical stack sat a document that made me feel the old house of my body tilt, because it bore my name in large letters and the words durable power of attorney for health care, and beneath that, in a font I recognized from cheap legal templates, a signature that purported to be mine, authorizing my daughter as my agent, dated 6 months ago on a day when I had changed the oil, in my truck, and eaten soup alone, and certainly not sat in a lawyer's office granting anyone the right to decide when and how I should be eased out of my own life. Behind it lay a letter from Dr. Pollard, the concierge physician who plays tennis with my son, stating with officious sorrow that his patient exhibited episodic confusion consistent with early cognitive decline, and I had to laugh very softly at the audacity, because the only time I had spoken with that man was after church 2 Christmases ago, when he congratulated me on my grandchildren's piano duet, and misremembered my name as Harold. I took out my phone like a thief and photographed every page, forcing my hands to stay steady so the angles would be clean, and as I worked I found the next layer of the plan, a draft petition for temporary guardianship addressed to the county court, the blanks for the hearing date left open, but the affidavits already clipped beneath, neighbors and colleagues ready to confirm that I had become forgetful and unsafe, a paragraph that cited a kitchen incident in which I had allegedly left the stove on, a falsehood I had already been forced to swallow at dinner months ago, and then slid into a plastic sleeve a single sheet that did not look like the others because it was cream paper with a watermark, and at the top it read, "Transfer on a death deed," and below it my parcel number and the address of my house, their tidy plan to ensure that even if the guardianship stalled, they could still treat my home like a bank with a drive-through window. And I felt a wave of grief, not because the law was clever, but because my children had learned its cleverness so well that they could turn it against me with a nurse's smile. I heard voices approach along the hall and step behind the curtain that frames the sliding door to the small patio where Susan keeps her potted tomatoes, and in a moment the notary stepped in first, a neighbor with a golf tan and a briefcase that looked new, the kind of man who says things like, "always happy to help," and he set the case on the desk and flipped the latches with a flourish that would have done credit to a magician, and behind him came my son, loosening his tie as if shedding conscience, and my daughter with the clipboard tucked now under her arm like a trophy, and they stood over the desk with the seriousness of people selecting a new sofa, and the notary said, in the calm voice of a man who believes stamps absolve sins, that he would need to see the original ID if they wished to affix anything beyond acknowledgments. And my son said, with a tone that carried a threat wrapped in a favor, that the ID had been misplaced in the hospital confusion, but that affidavits could proceed on the basis of personal knowledge, and the notary considered this with a frown that demonstrated due diligence, then uncapped his pen and began. They signed a stack of statements about my supposed decline, my alleged wish to age in place under family supervision, and the notary's stamp went down like a gavel, and then my daughter produced a sheet that made my ribs hurt, because at the top it read authorization for cremation and disposition, and she said softly that, of course, the funeral had been symbolic, there had been timing issues, but that the form would align the paperwork afterward, and the notary hesitated, and my son leaned in and said they needed to be ready, that grieving families often lag on these things, that efficiency was mercy, and I watched the stamp descend again, sealing a fiction that would have burned Nora's eyes if she could see it. When they left to rejoin their guests, I slipped back to the desk and took the authorization into my hands, and something in the weight of the paper made me look toward the shelves where Susan keeps her catalog candles and pretentious books, and there on the lowest shelf sat a brass urn I had never seen in their house, a tasteful thing with a thin band of laurel leaves, and someone had tied around its neck a tag with my name written in the same hand that had labeled the pans, and for a heartbeat. I believed I was looking at my own future. Then another part of me, the part that knows how props are made, guessed what it likely held: beach sand or garden soil or cat litter for heft. And the shame that flushed my face was not shame for them, but for myself, for the boy in me who still expected decency to intervene at the last minute, who still thought the world might call time out on a plan this grotesque. And I understood, as I set the urn back exactly where I had found it, that I would have to be the interruption. I kept searching because purpose needs evidence to survive its own heat, and in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet I found a folder labeled Dad Transition, a bland cruelty that would have earned a laugh in a seminar, and inside were printed emails between Susan and Kelton and Sons, and the subject lines read, "Confirm memorial without remains," and program copy, "Please insert private family interment." And in one thread, the director politely asked whether there would be any obituary details about military service or charitable designations, and Susan replied that simple is best. And I pictured her typing that with her coffee cooling while she weighed which ladies from her book club should be asked to pour punch. And beneath that email lay a checklist from a website that promises to make losing a loved one frictionless, and it included a box for close accounts via small estates affidavit where applicable, and another for update beneficiaries, and clipped to it by a gold binder. Clip was a handwritten list of my institutions, the credit union, the insurance company that had sold me the small policy Nora insisted upon, so there would be money for the grandchildren's first semesters, and next to each entry a check mark or a date, and next to the insurance company the words "Call Monday, accelerated benefit if hospice documented," underlined twice, and that line was the knife that cut through the last layer of my denial, because it told me that even the doctor's letter, even the forged power of attorney, even the obituary in the Gazette, were not accidents or awkward euphemisms for grief, but instruments selected and sharpened with a goal. And the goal was money, my money, the careful ledger of a life that had traded vacations for paid-off appliances and new cars for reliable used ones and dinners out for church potlucks. And now they meant to harvest it like a field they had never planted. I took pictures of everything, my breath careful and slow so the lens would not fog, and when the phone warned me that the storage was nearly full, I deleted an old video of a train I had filmed for the sound of it, and the small sorrow of that. Deletion only made me more determined to keep what mattered: the dates, the signatures, the plans written in their own tidy hands. I slipped the cremation authorization into my jacket, not because a photograph would not do, but because some documents demand the testimony of their own paper, and I eased the drawer shut with the respect I would give a coffin. And in the silence I heard a small sob from the hallway, and thought for a wild second that my conscience had learned to cry aloud. But it was a child, my granddaughter, the younger one with the nails painted like tiny marbles, standing with her back pressed to the wall. And her phone clutched in both hands, and she stared at me with eyes that were too wide for denial, and I put a finger to my lips, and she nodded once, her throat moving as if she had swallowed a stone. And I walked to her very slowly, the way one approaches a skittish colt, and whispered that I needed her not to scream, and she whispered that she would not, and her voice trembled so hard that the words shook. In the narrow space between us I could see the faces of the people I had loved and feared and fed, and I said her name and told her that I thanked her for keeping my secret for 1 minute more. And she whispered that they had told the cousins I had gone quietly, that it had been in my sleep, that it was a mercy, and she asked why I was here if I was gone, and the question was the only honest thing anyone had said in that house all day. So I answered with the only honest answer, that I was alive. And stubborn, and that her mother and uncle had made a mistake that needed correcting. And she said in a rush that she had heard things in the kitchen she did not understand. Words like deed and beneficiary and assessment. And I felt a strange tenderness then, because children are always learning the grown-up words on the day they discover what those words can be used to justify. And I asked her whether she could do one quiet thing for me, whether she could sit at the bottom of the stairs and make sure no one came down the hall for 5 minutes, and she nodded again with that mechanical gravity that means a child has accepted a task too heavy for her shoulders. And I touched her sleeve in thanks and went back into the study to scan for anything I had missed. In the closet I found boxes already labeled with black marker, not with the neutral codes of a move, but with the blunt decisions of a purge, to donate, to dump, estate, hold, and the contents told a story I had not been consulted on. Nora's quilt. Folded with care but tagged for the church thrift, my high school yearbooks tossed into the dump box as if the past had no resale value, the wooden planes from my classroom wrapped in newspaper and marked for a nephew who collects vintage tools. And at the bottom of one box I found the blue folder that held the will Nora and I had signed at a kiosk law shop in the mall, the one that left the house equally to the children and the little policy to be divided for college, and on top of it lay a yellow sticky with my daughter's neat printing, obsolete, replaced with TOD. And I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the contempt of that word, obsolete, revealed more than any affidavit could, and because I suddenly pictured a parade of antique radios and rotary phones and old men like me, all of us consigned to the dump box by people too hurried to notice what still worked. By the time I slipped out of the study, the party had shifted from polite to boisterous, that phase of a gathering when people begin to gossip about the living in the name of honoring the dead. And as I moved toward the kitchen, I caught fragments that made my skin feel too tight, my son telling a neighbor that it had been hard but necessary to keep me from driving, my daughter agreeing that the incident at the Olive Garden had indicated a decline in executive function, a lie born as a joke and promoted to evidence, and then, as if the evening required an extra lash, I heard my name in the mouth of a man I did not recognize, asking whether the workshop out back held anything of value, and my son said in a tone that tried to sound generous that the tools would be made available to the guys if they could haul them away, and I thought of those tools lined up like soldiers after every class period, the way I taught boys and girls to put them back with blades oiled and cords coiled, and I swallowed hard because there is no instrument for measuring the value of a man's order to those who never learned it. Outside, beyond the glass, I could see the realtor from the funeral seated on the deck steps with a plate balanced on her knee, speaking with my daughter in the bright shorthand of professionals who understand each other's needs without confession, and I watched as Susan pointed toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms and made a flattening motion with her palm, and the realtor nodded as if to say that a fresh coat and new fixtures would restore the property's competitive shine, and in that nod I felt the second escalation of the night, not because the betrayal was new, but because its confidence had increased. The way a storm gathers after the first rumble and remembers it is weather. They had dared a notice, then a service, then a reception. And now they were daring the paperwork that makes theft feel like administration, and the fact that the law would not stop them unless the law were forced to see me became the loudest drum in my chest. I slipped back through the mudroom and paused with my hand on the door because the urge to walk straight out onto the deck and end the farce had become almost unbearable. But I remembered the folders, the stamps, the urn, the list on the whiteboard, with Monday circled twice, and I knew that if I revealed myself empty-handed, I would give them only a spectacle, whereas if I walked out with the documents preserved on my phone and one paper in my jacket and the strength to choose my moment, I could turn their celebration into a deposition, and I could lay in the center of their tidy table, not just my living body, but their own signed intentions, and it would be their words, not mine, that undid them. At the threshold I looked back once and saw my granddaughter at the foot of the stairs, small and still as a lamp, and she lifted her eyes toward me with a question that could not be answered in that house. And I nodded once, a promise made without words, and then I stepped into the warm evening, closed the door behind me, and walked the long curve of the sidewalk toward the front yard where the cars were parked like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. And as I passed beneath the maple, I decided, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the next time I crossed this threshold it would be as a man who refused erasure, and that I would bring with me not rage, but proof, not noise, but the kind of quiet that follows a gavel, and that I would make them hear what it sounds like when a life refuses to be filed away under transition. I waited until the hour had grown thick with wine and self-congratulation, when voices no longer whispered strategy, but projected it with the lazy candor of people who believed the world had bent to their convenience. And in that moment I walked back, up the sidewalk toward the glow of the house, carrying with me the weight of silence transformed into decision. And as I reached the porch, I heard the strains of laughter that had lost their disguise as mourning, laughter that belonged not to grief, but to victory. And I knew that if I allowed this night to pass without interruption, they would succeed not only in stealing from me, but in rewriting me. They would fix in the memory of every neighbor and cousin the story that I had already gone, that I had consented in my confusion to their paperwork, that I was no more than an absence to be managed. And so I pressed my hand to the door and stepped inside, the warmth and the chatter washing over me like a tide, and for a moment no one noticed, for why would they? When the dead do not walk through mudrooms, but then one guest near the kitchen turned, his glass pausing halfway to his mouth, and he froze, and a second guest followed his gaze, and soon the hush spread like a contagion. Laughter snapped in half, voices collapsing until the room was a tableau of startled faces, and in the center my son lowered his glass as if it had turned to lead. My daughter's clipboard slipped from her hand and hit the hardwood with a flat report, and into that silence I said, with a voice that carried not rage but the steel of plain truth, "You forgot to invite me to my own funeral." The words hung there like smoke, and I let them settle. Let them find their way into each ear. Because revelation is a slow tide, and only when the stillness had thickened did I move further into the room, pulling from my jacket the folded sheet with its notarized stamp, the authorization for cremation, and holding it high enough for the nearest rows of eyes to read the heading, and I said, "They declared me gone. They signed this with my name. They planned to burn what they never possessed." And I tossed it onto the island so it landed beside the trays of uneaten food. And several people flinched as though it were an insect, and then I pulled from my pocket the phone, scrolling to the photographs, the whiteboard with its Monday deadlines, the forged signatures, the guardianship petition, the emails to the funeral home, and I turned the screen outward, passing it to the notary who had gone pale as chalk, and I said, "Your stamp is here too, neighbor. I hope you can explain how you met with a corpse." The murmur rose, half disbelief, half the restless stirrings of conscience, and my daughter tried to gather her voice, saying that I was confused, that this was proof of the very decline they had spoken of, but the words faltered because no one can claim senility of a man who recites the dates and lines of documents with the clarity of ink itself, and I spoke over her, not shouting, but delivering each phrase with the cadence of nails driven. "I cooked my own breakfast this morning. I drove myself here. I read every page you forged. I saw my name written in hands that were not mine, and I stand in this room now to tell you I am alive, I am competent, and I will not be buried by convenience." There was movement among the guests, some stepping back as if the walls themselves might accuse them, some staring at their shoes, a cousin crossing herself, and I saw in their faces the crack of realization, the moment when complicity begins to sour, and I pressed the point because silence is what had allowed this farce to grow. You all came here today to celebrate the removal of an old man, to nod while his children spoke of decline, to eat from trays bought with the money they had already spent in their minds. But I am not gone, and you will carry home with you not the comfort of their story, but the truth of this one. My son stepped forward then, his face a mask of anger poorly hidden behind a smile, and he reached out as if to put a hand on my shoulder. But I stepped back and raised my hand, not in violence but in refusal, and said, "Don't touch me. You try to erase me. You try to fold my life into your ledger, but I am not a line item. I am your father, and you will answer for what you have done." His lips moved, forming excuses, but the sound was drowned by the gasp that went through the room as I held up the urn I had taken from the study, its tag still bearing my name, and I said, "This is how far they went. They prepared an empty vessel to pass as my ashes. They were ready to stand here and toast the dust of cat litter and call it their father." A ripple of revulsion ran through the gathering, and even those who had been most comfortable shifted uneasily, and the notary cleared his throat as if already composing his own defense. My daughter's voice cracked then, the poise gone, her words tumbling over each other, pleading that I was misinterpreting, that the documents were drafts, that no harm was meant. But her eyes betrayed her, darting toward the whiteboard, toward the folders, toward the witnesses who now looked less like supporters and more like jurors. And I spoke again, my tone lower, steadier, the way I used to address a classroom when discipline had to be restored. "No harm was meant, you say. Yet you placed my obituary in the paper, you called my friends to mourn, you printed programs, you divided property, you signed my name, you mocked my life before I had left it. Tell me, what harm is greater than convincing the world a man has already died while he still draws breath?" The room had fallen into that peculiar stillness that follows a crack of thunder, when every ear waits for the second strike, and I provided it by pulling from my pocket the will, the old will Nora and I had written, the one they had marked obsolete, and I laid it beside the forged documents, saying, "This was the truth, this was our wish, written together with hands that still held the respect for family, and this is what you discarded because it did not suit your hunger. But tonight everyone here has seen the difference between the ink of love and the ink of theft." I looked toward the pastor who had officiated at the graveside, with solemn words, and his mouth hung open as if the psalms had been stolen from him, and I said to him directly, "You were deceived too, Reverend, but you will not walk away without knowing the truth." The neighbors began to gather their coats, not in haste but in shame, and one by one they slipped toward the door, unwilling to stay in a house that had turned into a courtroom, and the cousins lingered, some muttering prayers, some shaking their heads, and I remained standing in the center, the documents arrayed before me like evidence at a trial, my children cornered not by my strength but by their own signatures, and I felt in that moment not triumph but release, the way a man feels when a heavy beam is lifted from his shoulders, and I said finally, "I am done here. You may keep your house, your trays, your neighbor's pity, but you will not keep my silence. You will not keep the story you tried to write. The truth is out, and it will follow you long after this night." Then I turned and walked out, the air cool on my face, the murmurs rising behind me, the night suddenly wide and real. And with each step down the porch I felt the years settle back into my bones, not as weight but as possession, the reminder that I had lived them, that they were mine, and that no child, however ambitious, could subtract them with a notarized form. And when I reached the street, I looked back once at the house where my funeral had been staged, and I felt a grim certainty that though battles lay ahead in offices and courts, the war of truth had already been won, because I had risen in the middle of my own wake and declared myself alive, and there are few sights more unanswerable than the living man who refuses to stay buried. I did not sleep much that night, but for once the lack of sleep did not feel like a trespass against my body so much as a tax paid on clarity, and at dawn I made coffee with the steadiness of a man who has decided that the day will serve him rather than the other way around. Then I drove to Martin's office with the folder of photographs on a flash drive and the cremation authorization folded carefully in an envelope, and I sat across from him while the sun moved along his books like a slow hand, and laid out the sequence with the patience I used to bring to teaching a boy how to true a warped board, and he listened without interjections, only the small, satisfied nods of a man who knows exactly where to place the first chisel, and when I finished, he said we would file an injunction to freeze any transfer attempts tied to those documents. We would send a demand to the funeral home to preserve their communications. We would advise the notary that his stamp was now a witness rather than a shield, and we would deliver to the bank and the county clerk certified notice that I was alive, competent, and not granting power of attorney to anyone. And it was curious how quickly the machinery that had seemed aligned against me began to shift at the weight of simple facts, because by noon the funeral director had called to apologize for relying on representations and to promise cooperation. And by evening the notary had left a message, stammering, offering to explain that he had only acknowledged statements that he had never affixed a signature he did not see, that he had been misled by grief. And I wrote his words down in my ledger, not out of vengeance, but as one more measurement of how easily polite men let themselves be used when the request is wrapped in manners. Over the next week the town did what towns always do when a secret bursts in the middle of a quiet street. It spread, it revised, it divided itself into those who said they had suspected something and those who were brave enough to admit they had not. The pastor came by with a pie and a face that could not decide between shame and relief, and told me he would speak on Sunday. He would tell the congregation that the 9th commandment was not a suggestion to be set aside when a signature is convenient. And I thanked him because there are truths that require a pulpit to echo properly. And then I made the visit I had been postponing, not to my children, but to the credit union, where Nora's little policy rested like an unassuming bird, and I asked the clerk to help me establish a vocational scholarship in Nora Mercer's name, small but steady, for any kid from our district who prefers the honest language of hands to the jargon of slideshows. And when I signed the papers, I felt something unclenched that had been knotted since the day my children learned to convert affection into invoices. I wrote a new will with Martin, not dramatic, not spiteful, simply accurate. Modest bequest to the church pantry and the shelter that understands how soup keeps a man seen, a trust for that scholarship, a sum set aside for Marianne's hip fund, because decency should travel in both directions across a fence, a letter to my grandchildren, not a codicil, but a human thing, explaining that there remained a path to me if they ever wished to walk it uncoached and unfilmed, and everything else arranged so that no one would mistake my estate for a buffet again, and I felt older after I signed, which is to say, I felt exactly my age, which is a kind of peace. My daughter tried the door twice in those first days, and then the phone, and when she finally reached my voice, she started with the old mixture of persuasion and panic, offering to meet in a public place, to explain, to insist that everyone had overreacted, and I told her gently that the season for explanations had passed, that there would be no police report only because I had already chosen my sentence for them, exile from my affairs, silence where entitlement once echoed, the knowledge of their own signatures traveling behind them like a weather system, and she cried then. Not like a child, but like a woman outmaneuvered by the very competence she had claimed as her virtue. And I let the silence hold, because sometimes a man must allow another person to hear the size of what they have done. The notary resigned from the homeowners board and left a typed apology in my mailbox with a check he called a donation to the scholarship. I sent the check back with a note that his testimony would be sufficient, but the apology I kept, not to frame merely to read when I needed to remember that people can step backward out of harm. The days found their shape again, though differently measured. I repainted the porch rail where the summer had freckled it. I built a bench from the good boards in the shed and routed Nora's initials along the back the way she used to sign a grocery list when she wanted to show off. I walked to the park later in the afternoon when the light makes everything look like forgiveness. And sometimes the older grandson would pass on his bike and lift a hand, not committed enough to stop, but I took the gesture as an early repayment on a debt he hadn't realized he owed, and one evening the younger granddaughter, the one who had kept watch at stairs, came by with a bag of oranges and tears. She tried to pretend were from the wind, and we sat at the table that has seen more truth than ceremony and did the slow work of returning to each other, which is simply saying what is so without asking the other person to fix it. Autumn came, and with it the hearing at the courthouse where my children's petition for guardianship, filed in bravado weeks before the funeral, was withdrawn by their attorney with a mumble that did not quite reach apology, and the judge read into the record that the court had no concerns regarding my capacity and that any instruments purporting to grant my children authority were void. And I thanked the bench and walked into the bright morning feeling nothing theatrical, only the satisfaction. A carpenter feels when the level shows true at last. Life, you learn, is not an argument you win, but a house you maintain. And in the months that followed, I maintained mine with honest work and ordinary kindness. I answered the door for neighbors who had found their courage. I let the pastor carry the heavier words on Sundays. I sat in my pew and held the hymnal open for the new widower, who did not yet know which page we were on. And in the evenings I stood on the steps with a glass of water and watched the maples lean toward each other like old conspirators, and I miss my wife the way a man misses the shore after decades at sea, constant and without complaint. When the scholarship sent its first check to a girl named Alma, who wanted to become an electrician because she liked the sound of a circuit closing, I put the letter on the fridge with a magnet that says, "Make it square," and I said her name aloud so the house could learn it, and I thought, not for the first time, that if a life cannot be saved, it can at least be rerouted toward usefulness, which is a kind of salvation. As for my children, they moved to a neighboring town where people did not know their winter, and once in a while a piece of mail for them still finds its way to my box, and I set it aside for a day, and then, if the impulse passes, I write across the front, "Return to sender," which is both instruction and prayer, and on the good days I remember that the father I am is not the father they chose to imagine when money fogged their judgment, and on the bad days I sweep the shop again and let the smell of cut cedar remind me that clean edges are possible. In the end, the resolution was not a gavel crash or a miracle reconciliation, but the quieter justice of boundaries held, of truth insisted upon without spectacle, of love redirected into hands that will carry it forward. And sometimes, when the train slides past town at 2 p.m, the old house and I keep each other company the way we always have, counting the cars like a litany, and I pour a second cup of coffee and set it on the far side of the table, because there are rituals a man keeps even when no one comes, not out of loneliness, but out of respect. And when I drink mine, I taste, as Nora promised me long ago, how ordinary things can be made precious, not by who attends them, but by the stubborn care with which they are done.